Welcome back to the Fairway Performance Podcast. My name is Shaun and I'm the host of this show. And my aim for this podcast is to help you get the most from your most important asset on the golf course, which is, of course, your body. Now, in today's podcast, we're going to talk about how the pelvis and why the pelvis is such an important aspect or part of your golf swing and why you shouldn't sleep on training it. Now, the pelvis is important for two reasons. One, through tilting, and one through rotating. Pelvic tilt is where we can go anterior and posterior, so tilt forwards and backwards, and then we can also rotate the pelvis, which most people would understand as, turning through the golf swing. So pelvic tilt. So what are pelvic tilt and rotation? So pelvic rotation are essential for creating torque, maintaining balance, and avoiding swing faults like early extension. So early extension is probably the key fault which would come up if we are lacking pelvic rotation and tilt, because we are unable to turn the pelvis or rotate the pelvis and tilt it through the ball or through contact. And that tends to get people to extend the hips towards the ball rather than rotating through. So early extension is one of the big swing faults that we see show up with somebody who lacks these two traits or characteristics. But pelvic, or why does it matter in golf? So proper pelvic movement enhances your power, your accuracy, and your consistency in your swing. Plus, it also helps to reduce your injury risk. So how does it enhance power? It enhances power by allowing the full kinematic sequence to happen without any. I used an analogy this morning with a client who actually had poor pelvic tilting. His rotation wasn't too bad and pelvic or hip mobility wasn't too bad, but his pelvic tilting was really bad, just a skill which he hasn't practiced. So for him, I use this analogy of a hose. So if we think about a hose and we're trying to transport water from the start of the hose and push pressure up through to the finish and have the biggest stream or the most powerful stream coming out of it as possible, we don't want to have leaks along the way. So leaks along the way are these things like lacking rotation or lacking mobility or lacking flexibility in certain parts of the body, which gets us to compensate and change our swing, and we're essentially leaking power out so that we don't get the full potential out the top end of the hose. So think of your pelvis and pelvic tilting and pelvic rotation as two key parts to maintaining that a powerful stream of water going through that hose. The reduction in injury risk, to touch on that, if we cannot rotate our pelvis and cannot tilt our pelvis, then it puts extra stress on other parts of the body. And just above the pelvis is our lower back. And it's the thing that cops a lot of scrutiny as to being a weak lower back or poor lower back or not enough core strength, when really it's our pelvis that isn't able to rotate and it's putting pressure on the thing above it, which is the lower back, to rotate, which the lower back is not great at rotating. It's good at flexing and extending, so moving the pelvis in anterior and posterior tilt, but it's not good at rotating. And when we ask it to rotate, it gets angry, and that's where people start to run into a lot of problems. So the next thing, how do we assess your pelvic rotation? So we assess your pelvic rotation and control in golf posture, and we want to find out whether we have actually good pelvic movement through rotation and tilt. So the pelvic tilt test is hands across your chest like so. We're going to set up in golf posture, and then we're going to try and keep the upper body still while we try and move our pelvis forwards and backwards. And for lack of a better description, and one thing that I joke about with clients on screening calls is, if you think about a dog humping a pole or humping someone's leg, we've all got a picture of that in our minds, of that movement of the hips, the pelvis going forwards and backwards. That is what we want from our hips. So hands across your shoulders, set up in your golf posture as if you're going to hit, like a 5-iron or 6-iron, and then try and rock the pelvis forwards and backwards. So that's pelvic tilting, anterior posterior tilt of the pelvis. The next one is pelvic rotation. So with pelvic rotation, what you're going to do is hands across the chest. We're going to keep the upper body perfectly still, okay? So we're not going to move the upper body, and we're going to rotate the lower body as if we're going into our downswing, and then we're going to rotate it as if we're going into our backswing. Now, if you have good control here, you should be stable at the top and not rotate your upper body at all to move with it, and we should be able to keep that perfectly still. If you don't, then what you're going to notice is that your upper body tends to follow and trail what your lower body is doing. So if you find that you are trailing the movement and your upper body is doing what your lower body is doing, then it just means that we don't have good stability with it. And if you can rotate your pelvis, it means the mobility is there. Then we just need to practice the skill of being able to isolate it and dissociation, which I actually talked about on a previous episode of this podcast. So what exercises can we do to improve pelvic rotation and pelvic tilt? So pelvic rotation rotation can be trained by doing various hip exercises. So the 90-90 hip switch, our interior, I'm having a mind blank for a second here. Internal hip rotations, so setting up with our feet out at 45 degrees, heels on the ground, and then turning our knees in to do internal hip rotations. We can also do it with things like a pigeon pose. If anyone has done yoga before or Pilates, they might have done a pigeon pose as part of that. So it's essentially stretching our glutes out, which is going to help with our pelvic rotation or hip mobility. And then the last one is a lot of times people will struggle with pelvic tilting because they've got tightened or shortened hip flexors. So with all the sitting that we do, and I'm sitting right now obviously doing this podcast, with that we shorten our hip flexors, and when we shorten our hip flexors it means that we are pulled into anterior pelvic tilt. So it's pulling our pelvis to face forwards, which is anterior pelvic tilt, and with that it makes it harder to then go further into it because we're already pulled into that. So what we want to maintain is the hip flexors to be further lengthened by doing things like the couch stretch or a Samson stretch, or there's another great exercise which I use with clients called clock lunge, and that essentially hits the hip flexors and the adductors, which also help to open up the pelvis and unlock a bit of pelvic anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. Now having anterior, posterior pelvic tilt and also pelvic rotation, it's going to allow us to actually reach a better impact position. So if you've ever watched professionals reaching better impact positions, they don't have their hips move towards the ball or towards where they're swinging through, essentially, creating not a lot of room and, an emphasis on having to, turn the hands over in order to obviously turn the club head through the ball. If our pelvis is rotating and also tilting, then we don't have to do any of that with our hands. We can keep our hands set, and there's obviously less moving parts to the swing, and it's going to help us to obviously hit the ball a little better and more consistently. So what are some things which can show up, or things which are going to tell you that you have poor anterior posterior tilt and also rotation through the pelvis? Is obviously a bit of lower back pain. So lower back pain is going to tell us that there's poor hip mobility or poor pelvic tilting because the lower back's having to take over and do a little bit of the work that the pelvis should be doing in terms of rotating through the ball. We might also find that you early extend in your swing. We might also find that you have no ability to do a pelvic tilt. If we hold our hands across our chest and do the pelvic tilt test, you just can't do it. If you have tight hip flexors because you sit a lot, and when you're standing you can actually feel your hip flexors being tight. And then also when we do the pelvic rotation, so if you're holding your hands across your chest and then you're trying to rotate but your upper body is mirroring what your lower body's doing and you're unable to dissociate or have the hips move independently of the upper body, these are all signs that pelvic tilt and pelvic rotation are things that you need to work on and address so that you can start putting the swing on the ball that you actually want to. So the thing I'm going to urge you to go and do is to go and test your pelvic motion. So test the anterior posterior tilt, test the rotation. If you want to see a video demonstration of these exercises, please send me a message on Instagram. My Instagram name is @Shaun Diakoff, SHAUN.DIACHKOFF. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, you can obviously send me or put a comment down below. And then I'll send you a link to the videos on YouTube because they're hidden videos that only clients within my apps can utilize. But if you send me that, then I can send you these tests specifically so that you can do those. If that's something you're interested in, that's today's call to action, is to do that. If you're someone who doesn't want to do it yourself, you don't want to go and figure it out, you just want someone to actually tell you and help you with that and some support with it, you can obviously also reach out and we'll talk about getting a screening done and building out a program on the back end like I do for all of my VIP clients. So if that is something that you're interested in, you can also send me a message on Instagram and put the word screening in there, and we can start the conversation about doing a screening and how to build out a program for you. So that's two calls to action. One, if you want to do it yourself, and the second one, if you would like help and support in order to do that. So I hope from today's episode, you got an idea of why the pelvis plays such an important part in the golf swing and how it can show up in various different ways, like inconsistent ball striking, weak shots, lower back pain, and also just not hitting the ball consistently, having different ball flights and different shot shapes. So if you got some value from this episode, like, share, send it to somebody who would benefit from it. And until next week, guys, I hope you train hard and play well, and I'll talk to you next week.